Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this Sunday evening. It's with a great deal of pleasure that I've got Professor Paul Trebilco from the University of Otago, and he's coming into us from Dunedin, the theological centre of the universe as far as New Zealand is concerned, or at least as far as I'm concerned. And I'd like to begin, Paul, just by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background and what your professional career has been about.
Yeah, so thank you, David. So I grew up in Christchurch. My father was a Methodist minister. I went to Canterbury University and did chemistry to start with, and contemplated going on to do further study in chemistry. But at that stage I was not too sure about ministry, perhaps partly because Dad had been a minister and wanted to be overly I wanted to be really convinced of a call to that in that direction. But I decided I wanted to do some theology. I was really interested in the Bible in particular. So I came here to Otago back in 1983 no, 1980 it was, sorry, getting forgetful here, and did a Bachelor of Divinity degree at the Theological Hall, part of the Presbyterian churches set up here at that stage, and as part of the university. So that was a 3-year Bachelor of Divinity degree, and then I thought, well, actually I got hooked. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do long term, but I had the chance to do a PhD. And my wife and I, Jill, got married in 1983, and we went together to the University of Durham, where I studied with James Dunn, who was famous then, became even more famous within New Testament scholarship as just a really significant voice. So we had the time of our lives in Durham, doing 4 years there, involved in St John's College, an Anglican college. And then the big decision came as to quite what I wanted to do. In 1983, I had candidated for the Methodist Church and had been accepted, but the church very graciously let me go to Durham. I had 6 months and only hung a Church of Christ in the interim period, sort of between degrees, which was great. But went to Durham, and then discussions with the church, and just as I was in those discussions, a job came up at the Theological Hall. I'd never imagined coming back, but I applied and was appointed in 1988, and here I am still 30 years later. Just amazing how time flies.
Well, it's been a most distinguished career that you've had in New Testament. When you first started, Professor John McCulloch, I think, was also there lecturing in New Testament, and
no, he left. He left. So it was thanks to him that I got a job.
Right.
Yeah. So he went back to Trinity College in Belfast. I think it was. Yeah, that's the right name. So it's quite suddenly, and so there was a position was advertised. Gavin Munro took over his position, and Gavin's position became vacant, and I was appointed to that. So I met. It was interesting. He was John in New Zealand and Cecil in Ireland. So I met Cecil McCulloch, as he liked to be called in Ireland, a number of times, but we never overlapped.
At that stage, Knox Theological Hall and the University of Otago were kind of linked. There was a Department of Religious Studies, but since then, these two have merged, and the department has gone from strength to strength over decades now, and part of it under your own leadership. What would you describe the sort of student numbers currently doing theology?
So we have about 200 equivalent full-time students, Fs as we count them, which is about 500 individuals. So about 60% of those students are distance students around New Zealand. For some reason, people don't flock in vast numbers to Dunedin. The climate, I think, is always the explanation. But so since 1990, we've been doing distance programs, which has been wonderful. And actually, our distance students outperform our campus students quite often. So, and that particularly makes it accessible to people who are not able to travel, people with families, people in employment, a whole range of people throughout New Zealand, and actually a number overseas. So distance teaching has been great. We have about 45 PhD students, so the PhD numbers have really grown. Partly, I guess, because now we're really the only place you can do PhDs in most areas in theology, with Auckland having changed its focus a bit. We have master's degrees, Master of Ministry and Master of Chaplaincy. So, as well as undergraduates who are doing BPhols or BAs in religious studies. So a very diverse student body, which is just a great opportunity to have this various niches in which students fit.
Yes, and I think one of the real strengths of Otago University has been its keen interest in the disciplines around theological studies. Your particular area of expertise is New Testament studies. How did you get interested in this sort of obscure book from 2,000 years ago?
Yeah. So I guess I was reflecting on that. I loved the New Testament, loved its the writings, of course. I guess I partly found theology a bit philosophical for the way my brain worked. But I thoroughly enjoyed studying Greek and getting into the texts and so on. So it just became quite a natural sort of, this is where I'll end up. So I had some great teachers, Evan Pollard, one of them. I just sort of fell into the discipline, really, and have found it enormously enriching. Although one of the interesting things about New Testament studies is that it's such an eclectic and broad-ranging discipline. I've ended up doing quite a bit in archaeology and inscriptions and with Jewish and Greco-Roman texts. And so, the one sort of sub-discipline within theology is very broad-ranging in its own interests. Some sociology, some social identity stuff I've done recently. So there's a whole range of literary studies, of course, as well as language. So there's a whole range of different ways of approaching the New Testament, which makes it this really interesting and rich discipline, really.
I've noticed, I've followed some of your lectures, etc., and one in particular I thought was outstanding, and it was looking at the fact that Christianity had essentially spread around an ocean. And I can't remember all the exact phrases that you used to describe this, but it carried the very strong sense that from the outset, Christianity was never an isolated congregational affair. These little groups that Paul and others started regarded themselves as neighbours looking across the Mediterranean. That excited me enormously, and I think the thing about New Testament studies is this tremendous depth of excitement that can occur when we do take this text out and suddenly start to unpack it in the ways that you've been describing. What currently interests you? What grabs your attention at present, Paul?
So I've did a book a little while back on the ways Christians referred to themselves, self-designation. So brothers and sisters, believers, saints, disciples, the way Christiano. So really it was what if two people met on the street before the word Christian became really popular, because it's really into the 2nd century before that becomes the key way. How would they actually be able to identify themselves as members of the one movement? Would they have said we are followers of Jesus? Well, they would have said in the first instance about Jesus, but they would have said they were family, they were brothers and sisters, and they would have said they were believers, they would have said they were saints. A really interesting usage of language. So that got me really interested in how Christians thought about themselves, so sort of as a window onto identity. And I've just done a sort of companion volume on the way Christians talk about others, about outsiders. So in terms of unbelievers, how they talked about Jews and Gentiles, sinners, and how some of those labels are used, but also sort of deconstructed. Sinners are sinners no longer. Unbelievers can become part of the fellowship as believers and so on. So, and how they thought about, again, their group identity in relationship to the wider world. I also did some work on Ephesus a while back, and I'm doing a second volume on that, sort of Jesus to 450. So what do we know about Christianity in Western Asia Minor from the very early days right through the to the 5th century. We know a great deal about Ephesus and Western Asia Minor in terms of archaeology and so on, and I'm trying to get into some of that material. So that's the whole project on the way.
Well, I think for the average Christian that sort of goes on pilgrimages from Australia or New Zealand or America through the Holy Land and then into Asia Minor and possibly over to Rome as part of the same pilgrimage cycle. Probably Ephesus is the one that stands out for everyone because of the marvellous archaeological reconstructions of the ancient city. And you've had that long. I think you had an interest in Ephesus from the outset.
Yeah, so my original PhD was on Jewish communities in Western Asia Minor, so in Western Turkey, really as a background to Paul. So because there'd been a lot of discussion about Paul and Palestinian Judaism, rabbis and Qumran and so on, but what about Paul interacting with Jewish communities in all those cities he went through in Western Asia Minor? So that was what I did my original work on. And I followed that up then with Christians in Asia Minor, and particularly in Ephesus. And so that's been a really interesting focus. And there's lots of one of the issues in New Testament studies these days is diversity. So how were different groups different, and how were they, what did they have in common? And one of the ways of looking at diversity is by looking at regional studies. So what's going on in Rome and what's going on in Corinth and what's going on in Antioch, what's going on in Ephesus, how are these places networked together? How do distinctive things happen? How do they describe their commonality in Christ? So that's been a sort of a regional focus for my work too.
Well, I think all of that is tremendously exciting, but I also have a sense of some of the difficulty that there is between the academy and the church. That sometimes the academy, I mean by that within the university setting, etc., some of the scholarship can be stimulating for all of those who are interested in studying at depth, but that scholarship doesn't always trickle down quite so easily into faith communities today, into churches and congregations. Do you think that... Well, I may be making too much of this. What do you think, Paul? Is there still a bit of a gap between pulpit and pew in this?
So, yes, I think there is, and it's different in different places. I think. I mean, sometimes what I do most of the time is to read Scripture, and a lot of my classes are going through texts, Mark's Gospel, or I'm about to start a paper on Romans. And sometimes I think preachers perhaps sit a bit lightly to texts and don't really dig into the text, don't use some of the resources. Perhaps they are preaching thematically, which is fine, I think. But so sometimes I think the scriptures are not dealt with as rigorously or as deeply as they might be. Sometimes I guess we have different issues. As I'm about to start teaching Romans. Now there are all sorts of debates raging about Romans that really belong in the academy, and eventually, I guess because there's polarized opinions, scholarship comes to some conclusions, and those conclusions end up in commentaries, and away we go. But sometimes those debates are important in the academy, but perhaps not so important in the church. One interesting debate that comes to mind is a whole new perspective on Paul, which is really interesting and important in terms of how Paul relates to his Jewishness. And that does have all sorts of ramifications, but it needs to be digested in order to get out there and to be relevant, I think, to people sitting in the pew. We do a few things in the department. We do a thing called Faith Thinking, which is sort of 6 hours sessions. I've just done one recently on John's Gospel. What can we say about John? Let's dig into texts or themes in John in 3 2-hour sessions. Doing one later in the semester on Revelation. So we try to bridge those sorts of gaps. We do as a department. If one of us does a monthly column in the paper. And we try and get some of the things we've been thinking about down into the ODT. And so we're trying, and I guess partly our students too. One of the things I love about this job is seeing students' eyes light up as they really get to grips with a parable or with a chunk of 1 Corinthians or with how we understand Jesus. And that they're going to take that insight somewhere into a small group or into preaching and so on. So, that's I think it's perhaps a long-term job. But we're trying to teach people how to read Scripture, how to understand who God is, Christ, the Spirit, the Church, and I think those bear fruits. But it's a 3-year undertaking, and it takes a while. But it's vitally important, and we try to bridge that gap between academy and church as much as we can.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key reputations of the old Knox Theological Hall was that it did do that, and that's obviously the function that's now being taken up by your particular department. You mentioned just a little bit earlier back that you were less interested in, say, some of the theological debates. They were one further step away from the actual raw data of the New Testament. Now, I've got a personal question here. When I went to my first parish, which was in Ashurst, Bunnythorpe, and I'd never heard of the place called Bunnythorpe in New Zealand. Please forgive me, residents of Bunnythorpe, on the outskirts of Palmerston North. In that parish, I came across a man who had been in the exclusive Brethren, and he had gone into the open Brethren, and then he had become a Methodist. He had taught himself New Testament Greek, he had taught himself Hebrew, he was proficient, and he had done vast amounts of study at trying to make the texts fit a little better. And I became aware that sometimes we can assume that the laity don't know anything, when the reverse might be true, that they may know a lot more than the average new minister beginning to try and preach the gospel. And he related to the fact that I had learnt the basic Greek and Hebrew. That wasn't quite my area of study, which was more Christian thought and history. But from his perspective, it was vital that every minister learn New Testament Greek. And that's a discipline that I think is vital in terms of the craft of ministry. But how many students opt into Greek and Hebrew?
We would have 5 to 8 probably each year doing Greek first year. So we do 4 years of Greek and Hebrew, do it all by distance as well as on campus. So we probably have 4 to 5 people doing second to third year Greek and Hebrew every year. So it's something we're trying to promote, because there's not a lot happening nationwide in terms of Greek and Hebrew. It's only with us and at Laidlaw College. So we think that sort of academic study is absolutely fundamental. Obviously, that's what I do quite a bit of. I guess for me, the theological issues are vital. Sometimes it's a question of digesting those in order to lead them into preaching, I guess. And one of the things I love doing are sort of workshops and seminars and evening sessions and those sorts of things where you can sit down, talk for a few minutes, and then have quite a lot of engagement with people, see where they are. So I enjoy preaching, but I think the church should not put all of its Christian education into preaching. There needs to be a whole lot of other stuff where we're engaging with each other, hearing each other, and then a chance for some really good content. And as I say, the New Perspective on Paul has lots of rich insights, partly because it's a raging debate these days. It doesn't fit in the pulpit quite so well as in a seminar room or in a place where you say, some people say this and some people say that this is where they're coming from, this is what's at stake in this debate, these are the insights that each is sharing onto Paul's life and theology, for example.
Right.
So I'm very interested in theology. I think it's just a question of how one gets into those discussions.
Yeah, and I think one of the big themes in Christian thought and history is that actually most of the theology ideas that we tend to discuss have been discussed at some point in the past. We just don't realise the depth of scholarship, particularly in the patristic period, which seemed to cover, obviously didn't cover everything, but it seemed to cover a lot of things. I've got a particular question from one of our studio audience that I'd like you to consider. And it comes from Stuart Mannins, who's asked, he'd been thinking about the prologue in John's Gospel. And he said, okay, the prologue, he knows, mirrors to some extent the creation mythology of Genesis chapter 1. So there's that kind of quite well-established link. I think it came from Philo. I'm not 100% sure on that. But he then wondered whether the series of signs that you get the development in the first part of John's Gospel had a kind of a parallel in other parts of Genesis. And I wondered whether you had a possible answer for that, Paul.
Yeah, so certainly there's the rainbow is a sign, isn't it? The rainbow after the flood is said to be a sign in Genesis. I think the most likely background for signs is the signs and wonders language in the plagues in the Exodus story. That's the sort of indications, things that are pointing beyond themselves to what God is doing. So I think that's probably the more likely place to look, rather than Genesis itself. Certainly they're very steeped in Old Testament language and Old Testament discussions, although John is doing something different. I have a PhD student just at the moment who's looking at the signs in John and is arguing that the crucifixion and resurrection is the final and greatest sign. And that the other signs, the Cana sign and so on, various other signs, so there are 6 signs, but it's a Johannine term for miracles in general, are all pointing to the death and resurrection, which is the place where God's glory is seen in paramount significance in John. So I think it's that for John, they have a bit of Old Testament background in the plagues, perhaps in Genesis, but they're very much shaped by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and a way of focusing particularly on the cross and resurrection as the final sign of who Jesus is, and the final, paradoxically in John, the final indication of God's glory here in the cross and resurrection, as God shows ultimately God's grace, God's godness, that God will go even to the extent of remaking creation through the cross and resurrection.
It's interesting too that in John's Gospel it sort of starts with a question. Jesus says, "What are you looking for?" Yeah. And Stuart Mannins pointed out that's the same question essentially that God asks of Adam, where are you? Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about that before, so I just, that's why I put that one in. Paul, I've got another question from a viewer, Max Thompson, and he's particularly interested to know why you wanted to organise a course on the Book of Revelation. Yes, well, we have this thing called Faith Thinking, where we run sort of 7 or 8 short courses each year. And we actually do them in Invercargill and do a couple in Auckland as well. And we have a group of people who we get together every year to help us to shape these up and to make sure they're relevant to the church. And they said to me, please do something on Revelation, Paul. And I was, said yes. So I guess they are aware that Revelation it comes in 2 categories. Either people ignore it completely and have no idea what the book of Revelation is about, or people use it completely wrongly, I think, as sort of a map for
I guess it will be Donald Trump now, who features somehow in the Book of Revelation, isn't it? Where one maps off each bad thing happening in contemporary life is so-and-so in chapter 17 or whatever. So, these people said, okay, we want to know how we can read the Book of Revelation responsibly. And for me, that's about, again, Western Asia Minor, the area that I've been spent a long time studying, Ephesus being one of the 7 churches. And it fits very well into first century culture in terms of Jewish communities, but also in terms of the imperial cult and the dominance of Rome as empire, as well as having that vision, I think, particularly in chapters 20 to 22, of the future, of the hope that humanity has for God to set all things right. So I guess I was willing to get into this complicated and controversial territory because I think the Book of Revelation has a great deal to say to the church, both in terms of the interaction with culture, which is John's message is of the church to be very careful as to how it negotiates with culture and to guard its holiness and so on, as well as having future hope that I think drops off for some Christians in terms of the renewal of creation. So it was. I probably wouldn't have chosen the Book of Revelation myself, but I'm looking forward to doing this course in September when it is.
Right. And I think, too, Revelation is interesting because later on in Christian thought and history, we see different people treating it sometimes as being scriptural in the canon and sometimes not in the canon. And that's a very interesting debate, I think, between the East and the West of the church and between the various Protestant groups of the church.
Very controversial book.
Very controversial. Paul, I wanted to say thank you very much indeed for being able to join us in this broadcast. And I wondered whether you would be able to have the final word of one possible thing or a couple of things that you would want to say about a life in New Testament studies.
I guess, I've felt myself to be enormously privileged over my number of years of teaching and researching of being able to do something I love. I'm a Christian. I'm committed to the Lord, and to be able to study one of the treasures of New Testament, of obviously Christianity, the New Testament, has been just an enormously enriching experience. And for me, trying to make it come alive, both in terms of understanding the text fully, but also in terms of its historical background. What was it like to be a Christian in the first century? What sorts of interests and concerns did they have? How did they relate to one another? What was at the heart of their faith? Those sorts of questions. What did it mean to be a Christian in the first century? And partly I think that's interesting to me because there are huge parallels between the first century and contemporary Christian life, where we are a small minority, where we're talking about identity, what it is to be a Christian, how we relate to a difficult and sometimes negative culture around us that looks down on Christian faith. There are enormous parallels between the first and second centuries and our contemporary age. Some differences, of course, but, so the New Testament has always been a vital book, but I think it informs the church now even more, or just as much as always, because there are so many parallels between our contemporary situation of being Christians, of being church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the first century, where we're back to very much in that situation, which is a situation in which the church can actually cope and can thrive. We should see the New Testament as telling us that this is where God is with us even in difficult times.
It's a tremendous answer from one of the tremendous characters of the church and academic study in New Zealand. Thank you so much, Paul, and we look forward perhaps to recording sometime in the future again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, David. It's been a privilege.